In the late 1800s, a woman picked orange blossoms from a tree in South Florida. She put the flowers in a box. She mailed the box to a wealthy man in New York. The man received the box, who could not find it anymore. The flowers were fresh. They had no frost on them. This simple box of flowers changed American history. It started the story of Miami. Julia Tuttle owned land in South Florida. She looked at the land and saw a future. She wanted to build a city. She needed a railroad to bring people and supplies. Henry Flagler owned the railroad in Florida. Flagler built his railroad down the East Coast. He stopped at West Palm Beach. He did not want to go further. A massive freeze hit Florida in 1894. The freeze killed the citrus crops in the north. Julia Tuttle's land in the south did not freeze. She mailed the orange blossoms to Henry Flagler. She proved her land was safe from the cold. Flagler agreed to extend his railroad. On April 15, 1896, the first train arrived. Miami was now a real city. But there was a big problem. The land was not solid. Miami sat on a bed of porous limestone. Right above the limestone was water. The city was built on a swamp. The early settlers had to deal with mud and standing water everywhere. They had to clear thick mangrove trees just to put up wooden buildings. The ground was wet. The air was thick with mosquitoes. This was the hidden reality of the new paradise. It needed to grow. To grow, it needed to be dry. The leaders of Miami looked at the water as an enemy. They wanted the water gone. Who agreed to help? In 1905, Governor Napoleon Bonaparte Broward made a promised to drain the Everglades. The Everglades was a massive river of grass that sat right next to Miami. It covered the land with shallow, slow-moving water. Broward said the water was wasted, wanted to turn the wet land into dry farmland. Duquesne Estate hired men to dig canals. The canals were deep and wide. They used giant metal machines called dredges. The dredges scooped mud and rock from the earth. You dug the canals from the Everglades down to the Atlantic Ocean. The water from the swamp flowed into the canals. The canals carried the water away. The land began to dry out. It looked like a miracle. Miles of wet swamp turned into dry dirt. Developers bought the dry dirt. They divided it into lots. They sold the lots to people in northern cities. The drainage project created a new danger. The land was made of peat. Peat is decaying plant matter. When peat is wet, it holds together. When peat dries out, it shrinks. The drained land actually sank. The ground in Miami dropped lower and lower. In some places, the ground sank several feet. The land became lower than the ocean. The land became lower than the canals. The city was now in a bowl. The water was pumped out, but gravity wanted to pull it back in. The people built the city below sea level. This was a fact they kept quiet. World War I ended in 1918. The economy in the United States grew fast. People had money to spend. Northern cities were cold and crowded. People looked at Florida. Advertisements in newspapers showed pictures of sunny skies and warm beaches. The ads promised a perfect life. The ads did not show the mosquitoes. They did not show the sinking ground. The Florida land boom began. It was the biggest real estate rush in American history. Money poured into Miami. The population grew fast. 1920, about 30,000 people lived in Miami. By 1925, more than 200,000 people lived there. The city could not build houses fast enough. The price of land went up every day. A person could buy a piece of land in the morning, They could sell it in the afternoon for double the price. People bought land without seeing it. They bought swampland. They bought land underwater. They just wanted to own a piece of Miami. Carl Fisher was a man who made a lot of money from this boom. He made car headlights in Indiana. He came to Miami and saw opportunity. He bought a long strip of land east of the city. It was a mangrove swamp island. It was called Miami Beach. Fisher had a plan. He brought in giant dredges. He scooped sand from the bottom of the ocean. He pumped the sand onto the mangroves, buried the swamp under millions of tons of sand. He created solid ground. He built big hotels on the new sand. He paved roads, brought in elephants to give rides to tourists. He sold the idea of a luxury playground. The boom brought a terrible cost of living problem. The city grew too fast. There were not enough houses for the workers. There were not enough stores. The laws of supply and demand took over. Landlords charged huge amounts of money for small spaces. A simple wooden room with no kitchen cost more than a nice apartment in New York City. Food prices went up. A loaf of bread cost 5 times its normal price. A meal at a basic restaurant cost a fortune. The workers suffered. The men who drove the dredges could not afford to live in the city they built. Carpenters, plumbers, and street sweepers lived in tents. They slept in canvas shelters on the edges of town. They worked all day in the hot sun. They went to sleep in crowded tent camps. The wealthy buyers stayed in fancy hotels. They drank cocktails and talked about how much money they were making. The contrast was sharp. The rich got richer just by owning paper deeds. The poor got poorer just by trying to survive. Miami also developed a seasonal economy during this time. The boom was not steady all year. The rich buyers only came down in the winter. They came to escape the snow in the north. When spring arrived, they went back home. The summer months in Miami were brutal. The heat was intense. The humidity was heavy. The mosquitoes came back in thick clouds. The tourists left. The land sales stopped. The construction jobs stopped. The money stopped flowing. The workers who stayed had no income for months. They had to save their winter pay just to survive the summer. The city was dead for half the year. The summer of 1925 brought more problems. The trains were overwhelmed. Everyone wanted to ship building materials to Miami. The railroad companies could not handle the volume. They put a ban on shipping freight. No lumber could come into the city. No nails. No pipes. Construction stopped completely. People had bought land and planned to build, but they could not get supplies. They ran out of food because the trains were full of luggage and land deeds. People went hungry in a city full of cash. The system was breaking down. The water was still a problem too. The canals worked most of the time. But in the summer of 1925, it rained heavily for weeks. The canals filled up. The pumps could not push the water out fast enough. The streets flooded. Cars stalled in 2 feet of water. The fancy hotels had water in their lobbies. The water sat there for days. It smelled bad. It bred more mosquitoes. The illusion of the dry paradise cracked. People saw the truth. The city was built on a swamp. The swamp was fighting back. The boom reached its peak in the fall of 1925. The prices were so high that normal people could not buy any more. The buyers stopped coming. The speculators realized they had bought land they could not sell. Panic set in. January 1926 brought a massive crash. The land values dropped to nothing. The banks started to fail. People lost all their savings. The boom was over. The city was left with half-built neighborhoods, empty hotels, and massive debts. The people of Miami thought the worst was over. They were wrong. The weather was watching. The summer of 1926 was very hot. Ocean water was unusually warm. The air felt heavy and still. In the Caribbean Sea, the wind started to circle. A storm was forming. It moved northward. It crossed the island of Cuba. The storm tore through Cuba with terrible force. It killed dozens of people. It destroyed homes and farms. Then it moved out over the warm ocean water. It headed straight for Miami. The Weather Bureau in Miami knew the storm was coming. They issued warnings. But the people did not understand the danger. You see, the storm had been called a tropical storm. The word hurricane was not used enough. Many people had never been in a hurricane. They thought it would just be a bad rainstorm. They went to sleep on the night of September 17, 1926, thinking the wind would pass. The wind hit Miami Beach first. Carl Fisher's new sand was the first line of defense. The sand failed. The ocean rose up. A wall of water called a storm surge pushed onto the island. The water was 15 feet high in some places. It crashed over the sea wall. It swept through the fancy hotels Fisher had built. The ground floor windows shattered. The water filled the lobbies. Furniture floated away. The sand under the buildings washed out to sea. The foundations of the hotels were exposed. The buildings groaned. The wind crossed Biscayne Bay. It hit the mainland city of Miami. The wind was blowing at 150 miles per hour. The wind was not a steady blow. It came in violent gusts. A gust of wind would hit a building with the force of a crashing train. The roofs of buildings peeled off. First the shingles flew away. Then the wood boards ripped up. Then the steel beams twisted. The roofs flew through the air like giant blades. They sliced through power lines. They crashed into other buildings. The rain flew sideways. The rain hit people's skin so hard it felt like needles. People hid in their homes. They thought the wood walls would protect them. The wind blew the walls down. Families were exposed to the storm. They grabbed their children and ran into the streets. The streets were full of flying glass, broken wood, and sheets of metal. There was nowhere safe to go. People crawled into ditches. They hid behind concrete pillars. They held onto each other. Then came the shock that no one expected. The city had spent millions of dollars digging canals to drain the swamp. The canals had worked perfectly for years. They pulled water away from the city. But the hurricane changed the rules of gravity. The massive wind pushed the water from Biscayne Bay inland. The bay water filled the canals. The water level in the canals rose higher than the land. The canals reversed their flow. The water that was supposed to protect the city now attacked it. The swamp water poured out of the canals. It flooded the neighborhoods far from the ocean. Areas that had never seen ocean water were suddenly under 3 feet of water. The water was dark and dirty. It was full of mud, dead snakes, and trash. The drainage system turned into a weapon. The engineering marvel became a death trap. The city drowned from the inside out. The storm lasted for hours. The eye of the storm passed over the city. The wind stopped suddenly. The sky cleared. People thought it was over. They walked out into the streets to look at the damage. They saw total destruction. Houses were reduced to piles of sticks. Cars were flipped upside down. Trees were snapped in half. Then the back wall of the eye hit. The wind blew from the opposite direction. People who were standing in the open were hit by flying debris. Many died because they thought the storm was finished. The morning of September 18 brought silence. The wind was gone. The sun came out. But the scene was horrifying. Hundreds of people were dead. Some died when their houses collapsed. Some died when they were hit by flying objects. Many drowned in the floodwaters. The exact number of dead is still unknown. The city leaders did not want to scare people away. They ordered the swift burial of the bodies. They burned piles of wreckage to hide the true number of the dead. They wanted to protect the image of Miami. The financial damage was total. The storm destroyed millions of dollars worth of property. The land that was worth thousands of dollars a lot was now worthless. The swamps had flooded back over the dry lots. The roads were impassable. The railroad tracks were bent and broken. Henry Flagler's great railroad was out of commission. United trains could not bring food or supplies. The survivors had no water to drink. They had no food to eat. The National Guard came in to stop people from stealing from broken stores. The seasonal economy of Miami caused deep pain for a specific group of residents. Black workers formed the backbone of the city. They cleared the swamps in the early days. They built the roads. They worked in the kitchens of the big hotels. City rules forced them to live in one small area. The area was called Colored Town. Later, people called it Overtown. You don't live near the beach. They could not stay in the hotels they cleaned. The contrast in their lives was harsh. In the winter, the rich tourists arrived. Your tourists spent money. The hotels hired the black workers. The workers earned wages. The restaurants served food. The musicians played jazz music in the Overtown clubs. The area was full of life and money. Then spring arrived. The tourists went back north. The hotels closed their doors. The restaurants shut down. The winter money stopped. The summer months brought fear. The workers had no income for months. The cost of living in Overtown was high. Landlords charged steep rents for small wooden rooms. The rooms had no running water. The rooms had no indoor toilets. Families crowded into single rooms to share the rent. When the summer came, the families had no savings. They had to buy food on credit from local store owners. The store owners charged high interest rates. The workers went into debt. They spent the next winter working just to pay off the summer debt. The seasonal economy trapped them in a cycle of poverty. The sunny weather was a curse to the workers. The heat kept the tourists away. The lack of tourists kept the workers hungry. We were in 1942. The United States entered the war in 1941. The military needed warm places to train soldiers. Miami was perfect. You still need to be well such a man. The government spent millions of dollars to build bases. They built naval training stations. They built airfields. The Army Air Corps took over the hotels. The empty hotels became barracks for soldiers. Over 500,000 soldiers passed through Miami during the war. A sudden arrival of the military brought a sharp contrast. The government had endless money. They built new roads. They built new sewers. The soldiers had steady pay. They bought drinks and food. You could build. The local business owners made large profits. Miami was rich again, but the black workers in Overtown did not see this new wealth. The military bases hired local civilians who paid black workers much less than white workers. A black worker and a white worker could do the exact same job. The white worker received a high wage. The black worker received a low wage. To both sides of Britain's war, the cost of living went up for everyone. The low wages meant the black workers could not afford the higher prices for food and rent. A powerful woman decided to fight this system. Her name was Mary McLeod Bethune. She was an educator and a leader. She moved to Florida and built a school for black students. During the war, she had a high-level job in Washington. She worked for the federal government. She had the power to speak to the president. Bethune came to Miami and saw the unfair pay. She met with military commanders. She demanded equal pay for black workers. She did not shout. She used facts and logic. Who pointed out the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom overseas while denying fair pay at home. Her protests worked. The military changed its rules. The black workers in Miami got a pay raise. Who pay raise helped, but it did not fix the housing problem. The landlords in Overtown saw the pay raises. They raised the rent. The workers were back in the same spot. Your seasonal economy still stopped the jobs in the summer. The hidden struggle continued. You have to do dependent businesses. The war brought money to Miami, but it bypassed the neighborhoods of the people who did the hard work. The war ended in 1945. The soldiers went home. The military bases closed. Hotel owners got their buildings back. They prepared for a massive rush of tourists. The government wanted to reward the soldiers for fighting. The government passed the GI Bill. GI Bill gave soldiers money to buy houses. It gave them money to go to college. Millions of veterans looked for a place to start a new life. They remembered the warm weather in Miami. They wanted to move there. The soldiers arrived by the thousands. They brought their GI Bill money. They wanted to buy houses. There was a huge problem. The city of Miami did not build new houses during the war. The construction workers were busy building military bases. The supply of houses was very low, or the demand for houses was very high. The law of supply and demand caused a disaster. You have a big deal. The cost of living exploded. Rent prices doubled in a few months. A small apartment that cost $30 a month before the war now cost $80 a month. A simple wooden house cost a fortune to buy. Better fetters had money from the government, but they could not find a place to live. Families lived in their cars. They parked on the side of the road. They slept in tents on the empty lots. You opened old army barracks to give people a place to sleep. The shelters were crowded and dirty. Builders saw a chance to make money. They rushed to build houses. They wanted to build fast. They did not wait for good materials. They used cheap wood. They used thin nails. You put up houses in a few weeks. They sold the houses to the desperate veterans for high prices. The builders made huge profits. The veterans got weak houses. The builders did not care about the quality. They only cared about speed. The hidden cost of this fast building was the poor construction. The new neighborhoods looked nice on the outside. The wood was rotten on the inside. This fact would matter very soon. While the people fought over houses and rent, the water was preparing another attack. The spring of 1947 brought heavy rain. It rained for weeks. The ground was already wet from the winter. The rain had nowhere to go. The canals from the 1920s were too small. Water rose in the canals. The water rose in the streets. By summer, the farms around Miami were underwater. The tomato crops rotted in the mud, or dairy farms flooded. The cows stood in deep water. The city was wet again. The old drainage system was completely broken. September 17th, 1947, arrived. The date carried a heavy memory. It was exactly 21 years since the 1926 hurricane destroyed the city. A massive storm formed in the Atlantic Ocean. It moved toward the Bahamas. The Weather Bureau tracked the storm on their radar screens. They sent out warnings to the people of Miami. The people remembered 1926. They were afraid. They boarded up their windows. They packed their bags. The wind hit the coast of Florida. The wind speed reached 160 miles per hour. The wind was stronger than the 1926 storm. The wind hit the new, cheap houses built for the veterans. The weak wood could not hold. The roofs peeled off the houses. Need to thin nails popped out of the walls. The new neighborhoods fell apart in minutes. Bought the houses to keep their families safe, now watched their homes break into pieces. The storm surge crashed into the beaches. The ocean pushed a wall of water inland. The water filled the streets. The real shock came from the ground itself. The heavy rain from the spring had soaked the earth. The 1947 storm dumped more rain on the soaked ground. The water table rose. Water table is the level underground where the dirt is completely full of water. In Miami, the water table is usually just a few feet below the surface. During the storm, the water table rose above the surface. Water pushed up from the ground. The drainage canals failed in every direction. The rain fell faster than the canals could drain it. The canals overflowed. The water spread across the flat land. There was no high ground to escape to. The water covered everything. Neighborhoods far from the ocean were under 3 feet of water. The water was not salty ocean water. It was dirty, brown swamp water. It smelled of mud and rotting plants. Snakes and rats swam in the floodwater. The water pushed into the homes. It ruined furniture. It ruined clothes. It ruined the cheap wood floors. The storm lasted 2 days. When the wind stopped, the people looked outside. The scene was shocking. 90% of the land in southeast Florida was underwater. The flood covered an area larger than the state of New Jersey. The water did not go away. The ground was so full of water that it could not absorb any more. The canals were full. The pumps were too small. The flood lasted for weeks. Cattle drowned in the fields. The roads washed away. The cars stalled in the deep water. The veterans lived in their flooded, broken houses. They had no insurance. The GI Bill did not cover flood damage. The city had no money to help them. People got sick from the dirty water. Mosquitoes bred in the standing water. The fear of disease spread fast. The local leaders did not know what to do. They had tried digging canals for 50 years. The canals failed. The water won every time. The state of Florida asked the federal government for help. The United States Congress held meetings. 2 politicians realized Miami could not survive alone. They passed a new law. The law was the Central and Southern Florida Flood Control Project. The government gave the job to the United States Army Corps of Engineers. The Army Corps was the best engineering group in the world. They built dams and bridges across the globe. They came to Miami with a new plan. They would not just dig canals, who could do a massive machine to control nature. The Army Corps started building in 1948. Their plan was huge. They did not just want to drain the water. They wanted to manage it. They built tall walls of earth, called levees. The levees lined the edges of the Everglades. They built giant concrete floodgates. The floodgates could open and close. They installed massive diesel pumps. The pumps were the size of houses. The pumps were so strong they could push millions of gallons of water into the ocean every minute. The engineers divided the Everglades into smaller sections and built the levees to separate the water. They turned the natural wide river of grass into a series of giant water storage areas. When it rained hard, the pumps turned on. The pumps pulled the water out of the city. They pushed the water into the storage areas. When the dry season came, they let the water out slowly. The water was tamed. The land dried out. The builders sold the dry lots. The veterans bought new houses. The city grew fast. The developers made millions of dollars. Not everyone celebrated the new system. Marjory Stoneman Douglas watched the engineers work. She was a writer. She lived in a small house in Miami, spent years studying the Everglades. In 1947, she published a book. The book was called The Everglades, River of Grass. The book changed how people thought about the swamp. Douglas explained that the Everglades was not a useless swamp. It was a slow, wide river. The water flowed slowly from Lake Okeechobee down to the ocean. The water gave life to the birds, the fish, and the plants. Douglas warned the people about the Army Corps plan. She said the levees and pumps would kill the river. Who said the water was the source of life for South Florida. She said if they built walls to stop the water, the land would suffer. Pointed out a fact that the engineers ignored. The water in the Everglades was not waste. The water soaked into the ground. It refilled the underground aquifer. The aquifer was the source of all the drinking water for Miami. Douglas was right. The Army Corps solution created a new, hidden controversy. The giant pumps pushed the floodwater out to sea, but the water did not just disappear. The water carried dirt from the farms. It carried human waste from the streets. The dirty water flowed into the ocean, killed the fish. It damaged the coral reefs near the shore. The ocean water turned brown. The tourists did not want to swim in dirty water. Your big goals. The pumps caused a different problem on land. The pumps pulled too much fresh water out of the ground. The underground aquifer dropped lower. The ocean is full of salt water. The salt water moved into the aquifer. It moved into the wells. The drinking water in Miami started to taste salty. The city had to build expensive new pipes to pull fresh water from further away. The solution to the flooding created a shortage of drinking water. 1948 changed Miami forever. The Army Corps built the walls and the pumps. The city survived the water. The developers sold the dry land. The veterans bought homes. The tourists came back. Miami became the rich, famous city people see on television. But the true history remained a secret. The city only existed because of loud diesel pumps. The pumps ran every single day. If the pumps stopped, the water would return. The land was still below sea level. Who can trust of the basic fraud? The cost of living stayed high because the land was hard to maintain. The seasonal economy stayed because the summer heat never left. The hidden struggles of the workers in Overtown stayed because the city leaders only cared about the tourist money. The fight against the water was not over. Two engineers built a temporary fix. The ocean and the swamp were waiting for their next turn.